Relay access granted. Archive access granted. Episode 5, The 10th Voice.
I didn't go back below Site 9 after finding the lower relay. For the first time since this whole thing started, I tried to stop. I know how that sounds. By then, I had already chased a missing town through old maps, listened to calls that shouldn't exist, followed a dead frequency into the woods, and stood inside a relay station that had somehow stayed hidden for decades. Normal people would have stopped long before that. Maybe I should have. Maybe if I had, the rest of this would have happened anyway. But at least I could tell myself I hadn't helped it along. Instead, I spent the next few days pretending I had reached the limit of what I was willing to know. I went to work, answered calls, filed reports, came home, and tried to act like I hadn't seen what was beneath Site 9. The problem was that I had seen it, and once you know something like that exists, you can't unknow it. You can avoid it. You can turn the television up louder. You can sit in a brightly lit room until morning and tell yourself that the shadows in the hallway are just shadows. But you can't go back to being the person who didn't know. The phrase from the lower relay stayed with me more than anything else. There are supposed to be 10. I heard it when I was driving to work. I heard it while I stood in the break room making coffee. I heard it in the brief silence between emergency calls. It didn't even sound frightening anymore. That was the worst part. It sounded like a fact, a correction, like something in the world had been counted wrong for a very long time, and now reality itself was trying to fix the math. There were 9 names in the records we had found, 9 operators in the reports, 9 people in the photographs, 9 voices in every surviving tape Walter had let me hear. But the voice from below the station had said there were supposed to be 10, and I couldn't stop wondering what kind of person gets removed so completely that even the people who worked beside them forget they existed. I tried not to bring it up to Mara because I could tell she was trying to hold herself together too. She still came to work every day, still did her job, still gave people that calm dispatcher voice that made them believe help was already on the way, but I could see the exhaustion around her eyes. Every time a radio crackled too loudly, her hand paused over the console for half a second longer than it should have. We didn't talk about Site 9 in front of anyone else. We barely talked about it at all. There was an unspoken agreement between us that if we kept saying normal things, maybe the world would eventually become normal again. The calls ruined that. The first one came in just after midnight on a Wednesday. An elderly woman outside Benton said she could hear someone speaking through her television, even though the set had not been turned on all evening. She sounded more embarrassed than afraid. The way people do when they know what they are saying makes them sound unstable. I asked if the television was connected to cable or an antenna, and she told me it had been sitting in a spare bedroom for years, with nothing plugged into it except the power cord. When I asked what the voice had said, she hesitated long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then she told me it had only spoken 3 words. Please remember me. At the time, I wrote it down as a possible prank or confusion caused by another electronic device in the house. Dispatch gets strange calls. People hear neighbors through walls, baby monitors pick up other homes, and old radios catch interference. I wanted it to be one of those things. I needed it to be. 2 days later, a truck driver called from a rest stop north of Little Rock and reported the same phrase coming through his CB radio. He insisted the radio had been switched off when he heard it. He said the voice was faint at first, buried under static, but then it came through clearly enough that he thought someone was sitting in the sleeper cab behind him. When he turned around, nobody was there. The day after that, a woman called because her baby monitor had started whispering in the middle of the afternoon while her child was still at daycare. 3 people, 3 devices, 3 separate locations, 1 message, please remember me. That would have been enough to bother me on its own, but the strangest part was what happened afterward. Most of the callers forgot the experience within minutes. When we called them back to clarify details, they sounded confused. Some denied making the report at all. Others insisted we must have dialed them by mistake. The woman with the baby monitor became angry when Mara played part of her own call back to her, accusing us of using some kind of recording to scare her. She wasn't acting. I know what lying sounds like over a phone line. She genuinely did not remember calling. Her fear came later when she realized the voice on the recording was hers. Mara and I remembered everything. That bothered both of us, though neither of us said it directly at first. There was no obvious reason we should be immune to whatever was affecting everyone else. If the voice could erase itself from the minds of the people who heard it, why did it leave us alone? I kept thinking about Ash Hollow, about the woman who remembered the diner and the lake and the fireworks until she suddenly didn't. I thought about the old maps that disagreed with new ones, about roads that existed in one record and vanished in another, about Walter's warning that some stations didn't broadcast across distance. They broadcast across time. At the time, I had thought that was the worst of it. I was starting to understand that time was only part of the problem. Mara called me into one of the small conference rooms near the back of dispatch on Friday afternoon. The blinds were drawn even though the sun was still up, and the table was covered in folders, printed records, old photographs, and handwritten notes. She had that look people get when they've been staring at the same impossible thing for hours and finally need someone else to confirm they aren't losing their mind. Before I even sat down, she told me she had found something in the Site 9 personnel records. I asked if it was about the 10th operator, and she didn't answer right away. Instead, she slid a payroll sheet toward me and told me to look at the employee numbers. The list appeared ordinary at first: Worker 01, Worker 02, Worker 03, and so on. I followed the numbers down the page until I reached Worker 09, and then the next entry was Worker 11. I checked it again, thinking I had misread it. There was no Worker 10. Mara watched my face as the realization landed. She told me she had searched every folder twice: payroll, assignment logs, security clearances, maintenance rosters, meal vouchers, overnight access forms. Every document skipped from 9 to 11 as if the missing number had never existed. There was no name attached to Worker 10 because there was no Worker 10 in the records. Not a redacted file, not a blank line, not even an error note, just absence. I asked whether it could have been a filing mistake. Mara gave me a look that told me she had already asked that question and hated the answer. She handed me 3 more documents from 3 different years. Each one showed the same numbering gap. Then she gave me a copy of a crew photograph taken outside Site 9. 9 employees stood in front of the building, most of them squinting in the sun, a few smiling like someone had made a joke right before the picture was taken. At first I didn't understand why she had shown it to me. Then I noticed the space between 2 of the workers near the center of the line. It wasn't a casual gap. It wasn't the kind of uneven spacing you get when people crowd together for a picture. It was a clear, person-sized space, as if someone had been standing there when the photograph was framed. Mara spread more photographs across the table. Different days, different angles, different groups of employees. The same gap appeared in all of them. Sometimes it was near the center, sometimes near the edge. Once it appeared beside Walter Mercer, who looked much younger and much less haunted than he did now. In every image, the spacing suggested another person should have been visible, but there was nothing there. Not a blur, not damage, not a scratched-out face. Just empty air that felt occupied the longer I looked at it. That was the only way I knew how to describe it. My eyes kept trying to settle on something in the gap and failing. It was like looking at a word on the tip of your tongue. I told Mara that it didn't look like someone had been removed from the photographs. It looked like the photographs had forgotten them. She didn't laugh. She didn't tell me that was impossible. She only nodded and said that was exactly what scared her. Then she opened another folder and showed me a state archive index from 1983. Site 9 was listed under a communications research grant, the same cover Walter had mentioned before, but the personnel count in the index was wrong. It said 11 assigned workers, not 9, not 10, 11. Every surviving roster listed 10 employee numbers if you counted the missing worker 10, but the archive index listed 11 assigned workers. Someone had not only vanished from the records couldn't agree on how many people had been there in the first place. We spent the next hour comparing everything Mara had found. The official rosters claimed there were 10 numbered positions, if you included the skipped entry, but only 9 named workers. Payroll totals suggested 10 checks had been issued for several months, though only 9 recipients were listed. A maintenance schedule referenced lower seat calibration with 10 initials beside it, but one of the initials had faded so badly it looked less like ink and more like a stain in the paper. When I leaned closer, I thought I saw the letter C. Then I blinked, and it looked like nothing at all. I asked Mara if she had seen it too. She said she had, but not the same letter. She thought it looked like an E. That was when I realized the missing person wasn't simply hidden. Whatever had happened to them was still happening. The records were not stable. They shifted at the edges, not dramatically enough to prove anything to someone who hadn't already seen what we had seen, but enough to make you doubt your own memory every time you looked away. I took pictures of everything with my phone. When I checked the photos a few minutes later, some of the pages looked normal. Others were blurred in places they shouldn't have been, especially around the missing employee number. One image of the crew photograph had a faint vertical distortion in the gap, like heat rising off pavement. After that, I started seeing missing spaces everywhere. At first I thought it was paranoia, but the feeling became harder to ignore. There was an old framed photograph hanging near the entrance to dispatch, a staff picture taken years before I worked there. I had walked past it hundreds of times without thinking about it. That afternoon I stopped and stared. Everyone in the picture seemed real enough. The names beneath the frame matched the faces above them. Still, there was a gap near the back row that looked too deliberate. A shoulder leaned away from empty air. A woman's hand rested at her side in a way that made it seem like she had been standing beside someone. I counted the names 3 times and got the same number each time, but I left the hallway feeling like I had forgotten a person I had never met. The same thing happened at a diner on the edge of town. I stopped there after work because I didn't want to go home yet, and while I sat at the counter waiting for coffee, I noticed a framed newspaper clipping near the register. It showed a 4th of July picnic from the late 80s, families lined up in a park with folding chairs and coolers and kids running through the grass. There was a space in the middle of the group where the grass showed too clearly, a neat little gap that no one else seemed to notice. The waitress asked if I wanted cream, and I realized I had been staring at the picture long enough for my coffee to go cold. By Saturday morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to Walter Mercer's house with copies of the records in a folder on the passenger seat. The sky was gray, and the road out to his place looked narrower than I remembered. His mailbox leaned near the ditch, and for a second I thought the name painted on the side looked wrong. Not Mercer, something longer. Something beginning with the same letter but ending differently. When I blinked, it was Mercer again. I sat in the car for almost a full minute before getting out. Walter opened the door before I knocked. He looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. His eyes were red, his face pale, and there were deep creases around his mouth that made him look older than he had a week earlier. Behind him, the house was dark except for the glow of equipment lights scattered across the living room. Radios, receivers, old tape decks, scanners, all of them arranged in uneven stacks like barricades. For the first time since I had met him, he didn't invite me inside. He kept one hand on the doorframe and looked past me toward the road. I told him Mara had found the personnel records. He closed his eyes like he had been waiting for that sentence and dreading it at the same time. When I asked about Worker 10, he didn't pretend not to understand. He said nothing at first, only stepped backward into the dim hallway and motioned for me to come in. The living room smelled like burnt electronics, old paper, and coffee left sitting too long. Static breathed softly from one of the radios on the table. Walter lowered himself into a chair and looked at the folder in my hands without asking to see it. "You found the photographs," he said. I nodded. I hoped those would have disappeared by now. I felt my grip tighten around the folder. Who was Worker 10? Walter looked at the radios. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said I was asking the wrong question. I sat across from him. Then what's the right one? Walter turned toward me slowly. His expression was not confused. It was not curious. It was afraid. The right question, he said, is why anybody still remembers there were 10 at all. I didn't understand what he meant, and I told him that. Walter rubbed both hands over his face and let out a long, exhausted breath. When he looked back at me, he seemed older than he had a minute before. There weren't 9 operators, Caleb. The radio beside him crackled softly, though no voice came through. Walter swallowed. There were 10